The enemy. Man, from the earliest day, even during his sojourn in Eden, has been aware of two forces within himself ever opposing each other, one that would inspire and lead him to the highest, and the other to the lowest of thoughts, feelings, and actions. During his racial childhood, man named that which called forth the lower phases of his nature the devil, and thought of it as a malevolent power ever seeking to frustrate and keep him from the fulfillment of his desires. Later he questioned if it were not God punishing him for sins committed by withholding from him the good things of life. But not until man grew up and his real self began to direct his thoughts was he able to see that what was holding him back and forcing him to be content with present, if inadequate, possessions was but his own weakness of character and intellect, and that not until he had earned them could the powers unfold that came with knowledge and understanding, and could be exercised and controlled by him in the high use for which alone he began to see they were permitted and intended. And with this knowledge gradually came the realization that these higher powers could not unfold while selfishness ruled him, and that selfishness was in some definite way related to the devil of earlier days. It was then that man began to respond consciously to the leadings of his higher self, and to try to control and overcome selfishness. In so doing he found that when he yielded to the voice of self, trouble, failure, inharmony, or suffering always resulted. And although he knew this and sought to avoid such, yet there was something within him that was stronger and made him yield to that hidden and persistent selfishness ever seeking to maintain complete control. Thus he became aware that his greatest enemy was not some other person whom perhaps he had harmed or defrauded by such selfishness, but was that something within which was akin to the lowest phase of his own nature. When he listened to the voice of selfishness and not to that of his higher self, my voice, it always brought harm, and that it made him suffer until his higher nature could again come into evidence, and could enable him to hear my voice within, pointing out the sin he had committed against his brother, and the necessity of repentance. And then he gradually became conscious that when he considered committing any selfish act, voices encouraging such act and suggesting ways and means poured into his mind from without, indicating he was being influenced by outside forces, thoughts from other minds, that were ever ready to push him on to his and others' undoing, if he listened and yielded to them. Thus far man has come, learning that the cause of evil is in himself, in that weakness or lack of character which usually has selfishness at its root. But he had yet to learn that the source of evil is really without himself. For evil is not in me, whose mind is the only mind in man, but is inspired by the passions and thoughts sent forth by the forces of darkness, and which are ever seeking openings in self-separated human minds, where selfishness, which is of their darkened nature, is allowed to rule unchecked. Evil hates truth as darkness hates light, and cannot exist where light is. Evil cannot manifest and thrive in the light of truth, hence it must seek its own in order to live. And selfishness exists only because of the darkened sense of separation from me, inspired by the enemy of light. When man knows I am the only self of him, and that it is my mind, my intelligence, my will, and my love that lives in and grows his body and character and directs his life, and he is willing to let me rule, he has found truth, and that it is truth that is making him free from the power of self, even as darkness always must disappear when the light comes. It is this fact that proves that the enemy can find entrance into man's mind only when self in any way or at any time is allowed to control, even if for but a short time. Once admitted and his subtle suggestions listened to, he is almost impossible to drive out until he has accomplished his will. For the selfishness that attracted him gave him his cue, and he is able to instill his poisonous idea to such effect, by feeding and encouraging the selfish desires and passions found there, that the mind becomes wholly blinded to truth, and seeks thereafter only to satisfy the clamorings of self. And the enemy, who, what is he? Only the entitized form of the mass selfishness of men, that vast cumulation of the evil thoughts and passions of men's lower nature, appropriated by masters of evil, grown great and powerful by their stealing and feeding off of the vital forces that their unsuspecting dupes, at their instigation, had poured into such evil thoughts and desires, thus giving them direct power over men through men's own life force, now absorbed and incorporated into their master nature, which they could thereby easily use to bend men to their will. Do such masters of evil really exist? Yes, just as surely as evil men exist. These evil men are merely their servants, their dupes, their slaves, practically all unconscious of their masters or of any outside power controlling them. In fact, all would deny and wholly refuse to believe in the existence of such masters. So subtly have these masters worked upon and deceived the thinking minds of men by instilling into them wrong beliefs about a personal God and an abstract devil, thus twisting their understanding of the inner laws of being, so they would listen to and follow the prompting of their masters, who would then continue to control and exploit them to the accomplishment of their foul ends. But you ask, are these masters of evil living men, or do they exist only on the inner planes of being, like the masters of good? If you can conceive of masters of good, then you may know also of these masters of evil, for if the former exist, so do the latter. And as there is a Christ who rules and leads and inspires the former, so is there an Antichrist who rules and leads and inspires the latter. As the Christ can work on earth only through his disciples, who, through love of their fellow men, have emptied themselves of self, so that their higher nature is ever waiting upon and serving him. So the Antichrist can work only through his disciples who through hatred, jealousy, greed, and a continual exploiting of their fellows have grown so big and fat from self-indulgence and in their feeling of superiority that their lower nature has become a perfect instrument for the use of the great exemplar of selfishness. Also, as it is true that there are such masters of both good and evil working on the inner planes of being and ever inspiring their disciples, so it is equally true that both these masters are working also on the physical plane, living in human bodies, and doing the will of their respective chiefs who abide on the inner planes. Likewise do only those who have earned the right by living the life of their respective chiefs, the Christ or the Antichrist, ever come into personal contact with the masters under whom they serve. For the masters always remain in the background and work through their disciples and agents, whom they have raised to places of influence and power because of their faithfully doing their master's will. Those working consciously or unconsciously under masters of evil are always inspired and influenced towards evil, while those under the banner of the Christ are inspired and led wholly to forget self, and to work only for the uplifting of their fellow men. All is according to the great law, as above, so below, as below, so above. Good and evil are opposite poles, and therefore where one manifests, there must also be the other to complement it and balance its power. But remember, both are but men's concept of an infinite reality, which changes not, and cannot be affected by whatever men think of it as good or evil. However, there are only a comparatively few of both so-called good and evil masters working in human bodies at the present time, conscious of their master degree, although many are preparing to enter human existence as soon as perfect conditions can be found. The good masters, under divine law, will enter naturally into newly born infant bodies, and will overshadow others, their disciples, while the evil masters, where opportunity offers, will deliberately break the divine law by dislodging and driving out the souls of infants, thus stealing their bodies from them, or by driving out souls from mature bodies, dispossessing them, and thereafter obsessing and impersonating such souls to their friends and associates. Such in the near future will be of common occurrence, and will be made easy for them by all who succumb to fits of passion, indulgence in intense hatred, jealousy or self-pity, or continual brooding over wrongs done them, or habitual condemnations of others, and who will suddenly wake one day in another world minus their physical bodies. And be it known, the Antichrist is also preparing to manifest himself when all is ready and enough of such evil forces to serve his purpose are let loose on the earth and require his direction and control. For he has been preparing for this for thousands of years, training his masters of evil, who in turn have been carefully carrying out his plans with seldom any failure, through the agency of their earthly lieutenants, the great bankers and brokers of the money centers, the heads of industrial trusts, the politicians, the newspaper editors, faithless government employees and public servants, any and all soulless individuals who seek only for self, and who unhesitatingly strike down ruthlessly those who stand in their way. These know not they are absolutely under the control of these forces of evil. Even if they knew, their moral fibre has become so weakened through habitual obedience to the selfish instinct fostered in them, that they would have little power to resist the master forces ruling them. When the command goes forth, all these human agents will be compelled to fight under the banner of the Antichrist, him whom they have served so long, and who now claims and compels their absolute obedience. But, you say, what of the bankers, great industrial leaders, editors, and the many thousands of other high-type minds who are involved in similar exploitations, and who are more or less unconscious of wrongdoing, because of having been brought up and trained in the so-called capitalistic consciousness? These cannot at present accept such unproved statements as the foregoing, and will naturally side with their associates on the enemy's side. What will become of them? Will they be condemned and destroyed with the enemy, even though ignorant of evil doing? Do not be too sure of their ignorance, for there is that in every man which causes him to know when he is doing wrong, when he is taking advantage of a fellow man's ignorance, weakness, or inability to prevent it, to benefit self. While such do not realize the full extent of their crime against God, or know that they are actually serving the great enemy of man, yet the truth is now being declared and is being broadcast over the earth, so that in time every man may hear. When the great tribulations that are shortly to fall upon mankind begin to manifest, with ever-increasing and unmistakably vindictive violence, such men are going to think as they have never thought before, are going to desire to know truth for itself with a mighty intensity, and are going to seek every possible way of escape. They will first turn to the churches, who will offer them a Christ crucified, who they say will save them. Then they will turn to psychology, to spiritualism, to the different cults, most of whom will offer them a favorite platitude the enemy has been instilling into the minds of their followers during recent years. There is no evil, there is only good, when evil will be so everywhere about them that they can see, hear, feel, and therefore think of hardly anything else but evil. It is then that these seekers will be led by those masters of good, ever on the lookout to help every sincere searcher after truth to these declarations, and now they will be ready to listen to and recognize them as truth. To all such who accept and now know whom they were serving, and who are willing and anxious to renounce forever self and all its claims, to such will be shown not only the way of escape, but they will be lovingly led into a place of safety. All this anticipates and at the same time announces to all who read to prepare for the great battle of Armageddon, shortly to begin on the physical plane, and which is already practically won on the inner planes. For the enemy with all his cohorts are being forced by the powers of good to the outermost of such realms, right up against the physical, where many think they can escape by thus stealing into human bodies. But their existence there will be short-lived, for the battle will soon be waging with awful intensity in the outer, and the mighty forces fighting for righteousness will quickly bring matters to such a crisis that all the forces of darkness will be compelled to come out fully in the open, so that all people may see these forces and those who fight with them, and forever after will know them for the fiends they are. And the battle, by the very fact of its being fought in the open, will be won by the forces of light. For as darkness cannot exist in the strong light of day, so with these forces of evil, who draw all their life and power from darkness, especially from the darkened minds of men, purposely kept deceived and ignorant of the divine nature, their oneness with the Christ mind, when the light of divine understanding is thus poured into men's consciousness, they will turn about, and because of the very destructiveness of their nature, will begin to destroy each other, until none are left, and their souls will vanish into the chaos and darkness from which they came. But think not this is not all in the great plan, and that the Antichrist and all his cohorts are not now wholly under my perfect control. For it is through him and his opposing forces that I provide the discipline and the punishment by which man learns to know unerringly good and evil. No man can truly know good and evil until he has tasted and eaten to satiation of the fruits of evil, has been so taught and led to the limit of selfish indulgence by the creator of evil, self, that he learns the foolishness and emptiness of it all, and finally awakens as a prodigal son, and longs for his father's house and the place at his table for goodness and abundance, which he discarded for the husks of the outer world, and he starts on his homeward journey to his Father's kingdom. Those who have not awakened in this life to a knowledge of their spiritual nature must needs wait for a long, long period for another opportunity, for they cannot return to earth during the wondrous new age I have prepared for my children who have listened to my voice, and whom I intend to lead into the kingdom of light and love I am bringing down from heaven into the midst of men.